August 9, 1880. 10,000 British and Indian troops marched through Afghanistan in temperatures exceeding 110 degrees Fahrenheit. They've got 22 days to cover 300 miles of hostile territory, where every village could hide snipers, and every mountain pass offers perfect ambush positions. Their commander is a 5'2" officer named Frederick Roberts, who's attempting something military experts say is impossible. A forced march faster than any army has ever achieved in this brutal terrain, culminating in battle against an entrenched enemy with superior numbers. If he fails, British prestige across Asia collapses and the garrison at Kandahar falls to Afghan forces. If he succeeds, he cements his reputation as the only Victorian general to win major campaigns across 3 continents: Afghanistan, India, and South Africa. This is Field Marshal Frederick Sleigh Roberts, 1st Earl Roberts of Kandahar, the man British soldiers called Bobs, with genuine affection. Despite standing barely over 5 feet tall, he commanded absolute respect from hardened colonial troops through sheer tactical brilliance and personal courage. His career spanned 50 years, 3 major wars on 3 different continents, and fundamentally transformed how the British Army fought colonial campaigns. He won a Victoria Cross at 25 during the Indian Rebellion, pioneered mountain warfare tactics in Afghanistan, modernized the entire Indian Army as Commander-in-Chief, and reversed catastrophic defeats in South Africa during the Boer War. Yet his legacy remains complicated by the concentration camps policy that killed thousands of Boer civilians and his harsh reprisals against Afghan villages. The question that echoes through military history is whether Roberts was a genuine tactical genius who could adapt to any enemy and any terrain, or simply a competent officer blessed with superior British resources and technology fighting opponents who never stood a chance. The answer, as we'll see, requires examining 3 very different wars against 3 very different enemies. Roberts was born in September 1832 at Cawnpore in northern India, son of General Abraham Roberts, who'd spent his entire career in the East India Company's service. This wasn't a British officer visiting the colonies temporarily. The Roberts family had lived in India for generations, making Frederick part of that peculiar Anglo-Indian community that considered the subcontinent home whilst maintaining fierce loyalty to Britain. He grew up surrounded by military culture, learning Hindustani before he mastered proper English, and his short stature became apparent early. At 5'2", he'd spend his entire life proving that physical height had nothing to do with command presence. Educated at Addiscombe Military Seminary, he was commissioned into the East India Company's Bengal Artillery in 1851 at age 19. His early career was unremarkable: garrison duties, occasional skirmishes on the frontier, the routine of peacetime soldiering. Then, May 1857 shattered that routine forever. The Indian Rebellion erupted at Meerut when sepoys refused cartridges, rumoured to be greased with pig and cow fat, offending both Muslim and Hindu soldiers. But the greased cartridge controversy was merely the spark. The real causes ran deeper. Aggressive British annexations of Indian states, insensitive cultural policies, and economic exploitation had created simmering resentment. When sepoys mutinied, rebellion spread like wildfire across northern India. Delhi fell to rebels within days. Cawnpore, Roberts' birthplace, became the site of horrific massacres. Lucknow's British garrison found itself besieged. For the first time since Plassey a century earlier, British control of India seemed genuinely uncertain. Roberts was 25, a junior artillery officer suddenly thrust into the most desperate conflict the East India Company had ever faced. His family was in danger. This was personal as much as professional. He served in multiple capacities as British forces scrambled to suppress the rebellion: artillery support, intelligence gathering, staff officer duties. The chaos of 1857-58 meant talented young officers got opportunities for distinction that peacetime would never provide. During the relief of Lucknow in November 1857, Roberts distinguished himself in close combat. The siege of Lucknow had become symbolic: British civilians and loyal sepoys trapped for months, supplies dwindling, whilst relief columns fought through rebel-held territory. Roberts was part of the force that finally broke through, fighting house to house through a city where every building could hide enemy fighters. It was brutal, confused urban warfare where artillery expertise mattered less than personal courage and quick thinking. Then, on January 2, 1858, near Kudaganj, Roberts earned his Victoria Cross. The specific action involved disarming rebel sepoys in hand-to-hand fighting, saving a soldier's life under fire, and capturing an enemy standard whilst exposed to concentrated enemy fire. The Victoria Cross wasn't handed out casually. It was and remains Britain's highest military decoration, requiring exceptional valour witnessed by multiple officers. At 25, Roberts had proven he possessed physical courage to match his tactical acumen. But the rebellion taught Roberts lessons that would shape his entire career. First, intelligence gathering was crucial. The British had been caught off guard in 1857, partly because they'd ignored warning signs and failed to understand sepoy grievances. Roberts learned to cultivate informants, learn local languages properly, and never assume you understood your enemy. Second, mobility mattered. The rebels' greatest advantage had been speed. They'd seized Delhi before the British could react. British relief columns that moved quickly saved garrisons. Those that delayed arrived to find massacres. Third, combined arms coordination between infantry, cavalry, and artillery won battles. And fourth, logistics determined everything. Armies that outran their supply lines became vulnerable. Those that maintained communication and resupply could sustain operations indefinitely. By 1858, the rebellion was effectively crushed, though pacification continued into 1859. The British Crown formally took over India from the East India Company, ending the company's 250-year rule. Roberts emerged with a Victoria Cross, rapid promotions, and a reputation as an officer who stayed calm under pressure. He'd seen India at its most violent and learned that controlling the subcontinent required constant vigilance, military readiness, and understanding that British rule rested on a knife's edge. But India's greatest challenge wasn't internal rebellion. It was the northwest frontier, where the mountains of Afghanistan loomed like a constant threat, and where Roberts would make his reputation facing an enemy the British Empire had never successfully conquered. The northwest frontier was where British India ended and chaos began. This wasn't a border drawn on maps. It was hundreds of miles of mountains, valleys, and tribal territories where Pashtun tribes had repelled every conqueror from Alexander to the Mughals. The British concern was Russia, steadily expanding south through Central Asia in what historians called the Great Game. If Russia reached Afghanistan, they'd be positioned to invade India. Afghanistan therefore became a buffer state Britain desperately needed to control. They'd tried once before. The First Anglo-Afghan War of 1839–42 ended in catastrophe when 16,500 British and Indian troops retreated from Kabul, and only one man, Dr. William Brydon, reached safety at Jalalabad. Afghanistan had earned its reputation as the graveyard of empires. Roberts spent the 1860s and 70s learning frontier warfare through repeated expeditions. The Umballa Campaign of 1863, the Abyssinian Expedition of 1868, and countless smaller operations taught him that mountain warfare required completely different tactics from the plains. Supply lines stretched through narrow passes where one landslide could strand an entire army. Pashtun tribesmen were expert marksmen who knew every ridge and valley, making ambushes devastatingly effective. Roberts adapted by emphasizing speed, mobility, and never letting his forces become predictable. By 1878, the Great Game reached crisis point. A Russian mission arrived in Kabul, whilst the Afghan emir refused to receive a British mission. Viceroy Lytton ordered invasion in November 1878. 3 British columns crossed into Afghanistan simultaneously, through the Khyber Pass, through the Kurram Valley, and toward Kandahar. Roberts commanded the Kurram Valley column with 6,500 troops, and what happened next would make his reputation. The Afghans blocked his route at Pewar Kotal, a 9,000-foot mountain pass defended by 18,000 men with artillery positioned on the heights. A frontal assault uphill against prepared positions would be suicidal, exactly the kind of conventional thinking that had destroyed British armies in 1842. Roberts studied the terrain and spotted a track through supposedly impassable mountains that would let him flank the entire Afghan position. On the night of December 2, 1878, he led his force on a night march through freezing temperatures along that track. At dawn, his troops emerged behind the Afghan positions and attacked from the unexpected direction. The Afghans, facing the wrong way and caught completely by surprise, broke and fled. Roberts lost 20 men. Afghan casualties exceeded 500. It was a tactical masterpiece demonstrating that terrain which looked impassable to conventional thinking could be exploited by commanders willing to take calculated risks. The Treaty of Gandamak in May 1879 seemed to end the war successfully. Britain would control Afghan foreign policy whilst an Afghan emir ruled internally. Sir Louis Cavagnari became British resident in Kabul with a small military escort. Then, in September 1879, disaster struck. Afghan soldiers and civilians stormed the British residency, massacring Cavagnari, the escort including William Hamilton VC, and everyone inside. The new emir abdicated in chaos. British prestige collapsed. Roberts was given command of the Kabul field force with 7,500 troops and orders to restore order. He marched through the Kurram Valley in October, defeated 12,000 Afghans, blocking his path at Charazia on October 6, using the same flanking tactics that had worked at Paiwa Kotal, and occupied Kabul. His controversial reprisals against villages suspected of harboring the murderers would stain his reputation. But for now, northern Afghanistan was secured. Then came July 1880, and the crisis that would define Roberts' career. At Maiwand in southern Afghanistan, an Afghan army under Ayub Khan destroyed a British brigade. Of 2,600 British and Indian troops engaged, 2,500 became casualties in one of the worst defeats in British military history. The survivors retreated to Kandahar, 300 miles south of Roberts' position in Kabul, and found themselves besieged. The newspapers were screaming for action. Roberts proposed something that military experts said was impossible: a forced march faster than any army had managed through that terrain. The mathematics were brutal. 313 miles of mountains, desert, and hostile territory separated Roberts in Kabul from the besieged garrison at Kandahar. Summer temperatures exceeded 110 degrees Fahrenheit in the valleys, whilst mountain passes froze at night. Conventional military wisdom said wait for reinforcements marching up from India, which would take months, but waiting meant the Kandahar garrison might fall, and after Maiwand, British prestige couldn't survive another disaster. Roberts proposed marching immediately with 10,000 hand-picked troops, covering the distance in 3 weeks. His superiors in India were skeptical, but political necessity overrode military caution. The Viceroy approved. Roberts selected his force carefully: the fittest troops, the best officers, soldiers proven in mountain warfare. He left a garrison in Kabul and departed on August 8, 1880. What followed was logistical brilliance disguised as reckless speed. Roberts had spent weeks pre-positioning supply depots along the route, calculating precise daily distances that would push troops hard without breaking them, and organizing medical support to handle heat casualties. This wasn't a desperate dash. It was a meticulously planned operation that appeared spontaneous. The first week took them through mountain passes where altitude and cold nights tested endurance. Roberts maintained an average pace exceeding 15 miles daily, extraordinary for an army of 10,000 with artillery and supply wagons. The second week brought desert heat where water became the critical resource. Tribal snipers harassed the columns but never mounted serious attacks. Roberts' flanking cavalry and aggressive patrolling discouraged ambushes. By the third week, troops were exhausted, but discipline held. Roberts was constantly visible, riding up and down the column, checking on struggling soldiers, maintaining morale through personal presence. They reached Kandahar on August 31st after 22 days. 62 men had died en route, mostly from heat and disease, a remarkably low number given the distances and conditions. The troops were tired but still combat-ready, which was the true measure of Roberts' planning. Ayub Khan's 12,000 Afghans were entrenched in fortified positions outside Kandahar, expecting weeks before any relief arrived. Instead, Roberts attacked the next morning. The Battle of Kandahar on September 1st was Roberts' tactics perfected. Dawn artillery bombardment suppressed Afghan guns. Multi-pronged infantry attacks prevented the Afghans from concentrating their defense. Flanking cavalry movements threatened encirclement. Village by village, the British fought through Afghan positions. By afternoon, Ayub Khan's army was collapsing. Afghan casualties exceeded 1,200. British losses were 40 dead and 200 wounded. The siege was broken, southern Afghanistan secured, and the Second Anglo-Afghan War effectively won. Roberts became a national hero overnight. Roberts of Kandahar entered the language. He was created Earl Roberts and given a substantial financial reward. But more importantly, he'd vindicated a strategic philosophy. Mobility and decisiveness beat caution and conventional thinking. The Kandahar March became required study at military academies worldwide as an example of what proper planning and aggressive execution could achieve. Yet Afghanistan remained Afghanistan. The British installed a new emir and withdrew their forces, maintaining influence through subsidies and diplomacy rather than occupation. Roberts had won battles decisively, but Afghanistan itself remained unconquered, a pattern that would repeat when the Soviets tried in the 1980s and NATO in the 2000s. Roberts understood this. His achievement wasn't conquering Afghanistan, but demonstrating that British forces could project power rapidly when national interests demanded it. He'd fought Afghanistan to a stalemate that Britain could call victory, which was probably the best any empire could manage in that terrain against those tribes. By 1885, aged 53, and at the height of his fame, Roberts was appointed Commander-in-Chief of India. Now his challenge wasn't winning battles, it was transforming an entire army. Roberts took command of the British Indian Army in 1885, facing a force of roughly 140,000 British troops and 140,000 Indian sepoys spread across the subcontinent. On paper, it was impressive. In reality, the army was fighting with tactics that hadn't fundamentally changed since Waterloo 70 years earlier. Officers still obsessed over parade ground drill. Equipment was outdated. Medical care was primitive, with disease killing more soldiers than enemy action ever did. The Afghan wars had exposed these problems brutally, but institutional inertia resisted change. Roberts had 8 years as Commander-in-Chief to drag the Indian Army into the modern era. His first priority was tactics. The close-order formations that worked against Napoleon were suicidal against enemies armed with modern rifles firing from cover. Roberts instituted training, emphasizing extended order, skirmish lines, and individual marksmanship rather than massed volleys. Every unit, regardless of whether they expected frontier service, received mountain warfare training. Night operations became standard practice rather than desperate improvisation. Combined arms coordination, infantry, artillery, and cavalry working as integrated teams rather than separate forces, became doctrine. These weren't revolutionary concepts, but implementing them across an army of 280,000 men scattered across India required relentless pressure from the top. Logistics received equal attention. Roberts had won in Afghanistan partly through superior supply management, and he applied those lessons systematically. Ration systems were standardized and improved with better preserved foods. Mule transport was optimized specifically for mountain terrain. Forward supply depots were established at strategic points along the frontier so that armies could move rapidly without outrunning their supplies. These mundane improvements mattered more than tactical brilliance when campaigns were won or lost, based on whether your troops had food and ammunition. Medical reform was overdue and urgent. Cholera, dysentery, and malaria killed thousands annually. Roberts pushed sanitation improvements in barracks, enforced quinine distribution as anti-malarial prophylaxis, and organized proper field hospitals that could actually save wounded soldiers, rather than merely making them comfortable while they died. Disease mortality rates dropped measurably during his tenure, not dramatically, because Victorian medicine had limits, but enough to prove that systematic attention to soldier welfare produced results. The officer corps needed reform most desperately. The purchase system, where wealthy men bought commissions and promotions, had been officially abolished in 1871, but its culture persisted. Roberts pushed merit-based advancement ruthlessly. Frontier experience became essential for promotion to senior ranks. Staff college education was emphasized. Officers were required to learn local languages, not just enough Hindustani to give orders, but enough to actually understand the sepoys they commanded and the enemies they fought. This was personal for Roberts, who spoke Urdu and Pashto fluently, and believed cultural intelligence was a military skill as important as tactical knowledge. Roberts promoted a network of officers he trusted, creating what critics called the Roberts Ring. Kitchener, Ian Hamilton, and others advanced rapidly under Roberts' patronage. He was accused of favoritism, and there was truth to it. Roberts believed in loyalty and rewarded officers who shared his vision. But his defense was results-oriented. The men he promoted had proven themselves effective in frontier warfare, which was what India needed. When these same officers commanded in the Boer War and World War I, Roberts' judgment was vindicated, though not without controversy. The Russian threat dominated strategic planning throughout Roberts' tenure. The Great Game continued with Russia expanding through Central Asia, always seemingly poised to invade India through Afghanistan. Roberts prepared defensive plans, fortified strategic passes like the Khyber, and built railways to move troops rapidly to threatened sectors. The invasion never came, but the preparedness Roberts instituted meant Britain could respond to any crisis quickly. When Roberts retired from India in 1893 at age 61, he left behind an army transformed. It was professional, efficient, trained for the specific warfare it would actually fight, rather than theoretical European battles. His legacy was proven when this army fought in China during the Boxer Rebellion, in Tibet, and eventually in World War I. But retirement lasted only 6 years. In 1899, Britain stumbled into a war in South Africa that would require Roberts one final time. The Boer War began in October 1899 with British confidence that bordered on arrogance. The enemy was two small Afrikaner republics, the Transvaal and Orange Free State, populated by farmers. How long could rural settlers resist the British Empire? The answer came in December during Black Week, when 3 separate British forces attacked entrenched Boer positions and were systematically destroyed. At Stormberg, Margasfontein, and Colenso, British commanders ordered frontal assaults against Boers armed with modern Mauser rifles and smokeless powder, dug into prepared positions. Over 3,000 British casualties in 7 days. 3 towns, Ladysmith, Kimberley, and Mafeking, found themselves besieged. The nation was stunned. These weren't technologically inferior tribesmen. The Boers were expert marksmen, brilliant horsemen, and tactically sophisticated. The government turned to Roberts. He was 67, technically retired, and hadn't commanded in the field for 6 years. But he was also Britain's most successful living general, and desperation overrode concerns about age. In December 1899, Roberts was appointed Commander-in-Chief South Africa, with Kitchener as his Chief of Staff. He arrived in January 1900 with massive reinforcements, bringing British strength to 180,000 troops. Roberts's assessment was scathing. Previous commanders had used tactics that would have been outdated at Waterloo. Frontal assaults against entrenched enemies armed with modern rifles were simply suicide. The Boers' advantages were mobility and marksmanship. Roberts's strategy was to ignore the besieged towns temporarily, controversial but necessary, and drive straight for the Boer capitals. Cut their supply lines, capture Bloemfontein and Pretoria, force them to fight on British terms. February brought the relief of Kimberley through aggressive cavalry use. Then the Battle of Paardeberg, where Boer General Piet Cronje found his 4,000-man force surrounded. Kitchener initially ordered frontal assaults that produced hundreds of casualties for no gain. Roberts overruled him and imposed siege conditions instead. On February 27, the anniversary of Britain's humiliating defeat at Majuba 19 years earlier, Cronje surrendered. It was the first major Boer general captured and a psychological turning point. March 13 saw Bloemfontein captured, the Orange Free State capital falling with minimal resistance. But Roberts paused here, and the pause proved costly. Typhoid swept through the British camps, killing hundreds. Roberts was blamed for inadequate water sanitation. The same medical planning that had worked in Afghanistan failed in South Africa's different conditions. By the time the advance resumed, thousands were ill. May and June brought the climactic drive. Johannesburg fell on May 31st. Pretoria, the Transvaal capital, was captured on June 5th. President Paul Kruger fled into exile. Conventional military wisdom said the war was won. Both enemy capitals captured, their governments dissolved, their main armies scattered. Roberts believed it was effectively over. He was catastrophically wrong. The Boers transformed into guerrilla fighters. Small mounted commandos conducted hit-and-run raids, sabotaged railways, attacked supply convoys, and melted into the countryside. Roberts' response was the scorched earth policy that would forever stain his reputation. Boer farms suspected of harboring guerrillas were burned. Civilians were interned in concentration camps to prevent them from supplying the commandos. The camps were overcrowded, undersupplied, and riddled with disease. Approximately 28,000 Boers died, mostly women and children, from typhoid, dysentery, and measles. International outrage was immediate and justified. Roberts defended it as military necessity, denying the guerrillas their support base. But history's judgment has been harsh. In November 1900, Roberts declared victory and returned to Britain, leaving Kitchener to finish the war. But the guerrilla phase continued for 18 more brutal months until May 1902. Roberts had reversed the disasters of Black Week and captured the enemy capitals, demonstrating tactical competence. But he'd underestimated the Boer determination and implemented policies that killed thousands of civilians. It was military success purchased with moral failure, and Roberts' legacy would forever include those concentration camp deaths alongside his battlefield victories. He returned to Britain as Commander-in-Chief of the British Army, the pinnacle of his profession. But one more chapter remained. Section 7. Roberts spent his final years as Britain's elder military statesman, and he used that platform to deliver warnings nobody wanted to hear. Appointed Commander-in-Chief of the British Army in 1900, he advocated relentlessly for military reforms and preparation for the European war he saw coming. Germany was expanding its navy, building an army that dwarfed Britain's, and pursuing aggressive diplomacy. Roberts argued publicly for conscription, mandatory military service, to build the mass army Britain would need. The public despised the idea. Britain prided itself on a volunteer professional army, not continental-style conscription. Roberts was called a warmonger and alarmist. His warnings were ignored. He retired officially in 1904, but remained active, writing, speaking, and campaigning for military readiness. His autobiography, 41 Years in India, became a bestseller, cementing his reputation as Britain's greatest living soldier. The public loved Bobs. The affectionate nickname had spread from the army to the nation. He was the last great Victorian military hero, living proof that Britain could still produce warriors who won impossible campaigns. But Roberts saw clearly that the world was changing, that the colonial wars he'd mastered were ending, and that industrial-scale European warfare approached. When World War I erupted in August 1914, Roberts was 81. He'd been proven right about Germany, though he took no satisfaction in it. The British expeditionary force he'd helped modernize fought in France, but it was tiny compared to German and French armies. Conscription, which Roberts had advocated for a decade, would eventually be implemented in 1916, but by then, millions had already died. Roberts spent autumn 1914 visiting British troops in France, still trying to serve despite his age. On November 14, 1914, while visiting Indian troops at the front, he caught a chill that developed into pneumonia. He died on November 14, 1914, at Saint-Omer in France, surrounded by the soldiers he'd spent his life leading. The symbolism was perfect. The old general died visiting troops, still serving, brought down not by Afghan bullets or Boer rifles, but by age and illness, whilst trying to help his army one final time. So how did one 5'2" officer become the only British general to win major campaigns across 3 continents? The answer lies in understanding what Roberts actually achieved and how he achieved it. In Afghanistan, he won the Battle of Pewar Kotal through tactical innovation, night flanking marches through supposedly impassable terrain, and sealed his reputation with the Kandahar March, covering 313 miles in 22 days and winning the decisive battle immediately upon arrival. In India, he earned his Victoria Cross during the rebellion at age 25, then spent 8 years as Commander-in-Chief, modernizing an entire army of 280,000 men. In South Africa, he reversed the disasters of Black Week, captured both Boer capitals within 6 months, and changed the war's trajectory despite being 67 years old. The question of genius versus resources has a nuanced answer. Roberts absolutely had advantages his enemies lacked: better logistics, superior artillery, trained professional soldiers, and the British Empire's industrial backing. The Afghans, Indian rebels, and Boers were fighting with inferior resources. But other British generals had the same advantages and failed catastrophically. Black Week proved that resources alone guaranteed nothing. The First Anglo-Afghan War demonstrated that superior British forces could be annihilated by supposedly inferior opponents. What distinguished Roberts was how he used his advantages. He adapted tactics to terrain and enemy instead of applying rigid doctrine. Against Afghan tribesmen in mountains, he used flanking maneuvers and night attacks. Against Boer mounted infantry on the veldt, he emphasized mobility and cavalry. He mastered logistics, understanding that battles were won by armies that maintained supply lines rather than those that achieved tactical brilliance whilst starving. He learned enemy languages and cultures, treating cultural intelligence as a military skill, and he cared visibly about soldier welfare, which maintained morale through brutal campaigns. His innovations influenced 20th century warfare. Combined arms coordination, cultural intelligence, logistics-focused planning. These became standard military practice. His protégés commanded in World War I, applying lessons learned under Roberts. The Indian Army he modernized fought effectively across multiple theaters from 1914 to 1918. Yet the moral accounting cannot be avoided. The concentration camps that killed 28,000 Boer civilians remain an inexcusable humanitarian disaster. The Afghan village reprisals after Cavagnari's murder violated principles of proportionality. Roberts fought for an empire built on exploitation and racism. His military excellence served a fundamentally unjust system. Modern relevance appears in unexpected places. Afghanistan remains the graveyard of empires. The Soviets failed there in the 1980s. NATO struggled for 20 years before withdrawing in 2021. Roberts won battles, but Britain eventually left Afghanistan, just as later powers would. His South African experience pioneered counterinsurgency tactics, but also demonstrated how conventional victory doesn't guarantee strategic success when guerrillas refuse to accept defeat. The Boers' guerrilla warfare presaged tactics used throughout the 20th century, from Vietnam to Iraq. The lessons Roberts's career teaches are timeless. Understanding your enemy culturally and linguistically matters as much as tactical skill. Logistics determines outcomes more than battlefield brilliance. Mobility and adaptability beat rigid doctrine. Leadership requires being visible to troops and sharing their hardships. But also, military success doesn't erase moral failures. Winning battles while implementing policies that kill thousands of civilians isn't glory. It's tragedy with a victory parade. Roberts died in 1914, believing he'd prepared Britain for the coming war, and he had, partially. His reforms helped, his warnings about Germany proved accurate, and his protégés commanded effectively. But World War I's industrial slaughter exceeded anything his colonial campaigns prepared armies for. The wars he mastered, mobile operations across difficult terrain against sophisticated but smaller enemies, belonged to a dying era. Field Marshal Frederick Roberts remains the most successful British colonial general, a man who won impossible campaigns through competence, planning, and ruthless execution. Whether we should celebrate that success given the imperial context it served remains an uncomfortable question with no easy answer. History remembers him as both military genius and architect of humanitarian disasters, a complexity that probably reflects reality more accurately than simple hero worship or condemnation ever could.